Another breaking event this evening, and that's new information on why this nation's top vaccine doctor was forced out of his job. We first told you about this last night. StatNews' Nick Florko broke that story, and he joins us now with more. It's good to have you here this evening. What more can you tell us tonight?
So, like you mentioned yesterday, we broke the news that Dr. Bright was being reassigned from the head of BARDA, which is this government department that partners with drug makers developing treatments for infectious diseases, to a lower level position at the NIH. Today, Dr. Bright put out a statement claiming that he was involuntarily transferred to that position because he, quote, resisted efforts to fund potentially dangerous drugs promoted by those with political connections. And then he mentioned specifically chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, which are these unproven malaria drugs that President Trump himself has been touting as potential cures for COVID-19.
He's saying it was directly because of his opposition to the promotion of hydroxychloroquine?
Yes, he is. He's saying that he was pushing for the administration only to tout drugs that were proven by science. And like a lot of other experts, he's raised concerns about the lack of evidence supporting hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. Now, we don't have a lot of details as to exactly how Dr. Bright spoke out. What we do know is that he was at least somewhat involved in the decision to add those drugs to the national stockpile, which is the stockpile of supplies that the U.S. has on hand for outbreaks like this. The government did accept donations of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Dr. Bright was involved in that decision as the head of BARDA. But when that first broke, it was controversial, but we didn't know that Dr. Bright himself had concerns with that. And now that seems to be coming to light.
What are we learning, if anything? Has there been any reaction from the administration to what Dr. Bright said this evening?
There hasn't been a lot of on-the-record reaction from HHS or from the White House. It's certainly making splashes on Capitol Hill. We're already seeing some Democrats calling for an investigation. And I could just say that from my conversation with sources in industry, they know the story is probably a bit more complicated than this statement from Dr. Bright shows. They note that Dr. Bright and his boss, Bob Kadlec, who is the head of he's the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS. He has oversight over BARDA. The two of them have had a tumultuous relationship in the past. There have been concerns about the speed by which BARDA has worked in the past, and they say that a lot of those complaints fall on Dr. Bright.
Nick, we appreciate it very much. That's Nick Florko joining us from Stat News. We'll come back to Dr. Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb, what do you make of this new report, this statement from Dr. Bright, whom you worked with, who you told us last night that you were friends with?
Yeah, look, I'm sorry to see Rick leave. I think he was very effective in the job, and I worked effectively with him when I was at FDA. We worked on the Ebola vaccine together. He helped advance that. We worked on a therapeutic for smallpox that he helped advance through the work he did at BARDA. And, you know, he was good in the job, and he was good in the role, and I think he was the right person to have in that role right now, given his expertise, his background in vaccines in particular. And you certainly want continuity in that position. I don't know the reasons for his departure. I know Rick to be someone who speaks his mind, speaks plainly, and speaks truthfully. So I take him at his word in terms of what he says, but I don't know the details around his departure.
But you did tell us last night that you do think it sets us back somewhat in our effort to have a vaccine to deal with coronavirus.
Look, I think it's we're going to take a step back in terms of the continuity in a very critical position right now. He's the one in charge of giving out grant money, including money that was put into the CARES Act to help stand up manufacturing, do advanced manufacturing of a vaccine and get commercial scale manufacturing in place before a vaccine ultimately is approved so we have adequate doses. All of that work Rick was in charge of, Rick was heading up. And so trying to bring in someone else into the job, albeit they're bringing in his deputy who's going to bring continuity into the position. He's already been there in that role. But, you know, Rick had stature, Rick had prominence. People on Capitol Hill knew him and trusted him. People in the industry knew how to reach him, had worked with him over a long period of time. So it's suboptimal to see him step out. I would have preferred to see him remain in that job. I think he was doing a good job.
A couple of other items I'd like to discuss with you before I let you go. There was a report today that the first U.S. coronavirus deaths occurred much earlier than first thought. 2 in the Los Angeles area dating back to February 6th, rather than the first death in Washington state. I'm wondering what that tells us about how early the virus was seeing community spread here, and how we should be thinking about now how many people may have been exposed to the virus.
Yeah, it's consistent with what we understood in terms of the early cases. We know that some early cases got into the United States in mid-January before the travel restrictions were put in place. These were cases that came from China. And we know that for a fact in Seattle, based on the excellent work by Trevor Bedford, sequencing those strains and dating their origin. So it's not surprising to see cases that might have come into the California area as well, where you get a lot of travel from China into that area, into San Francisco in particular, as well as Los Angeles, that there might have been cases that came in around the same time period. So we'll have to sequence these and try to date them and figure out when they came into the country. But we know the West Coast got seeded earlier from travel from China. The East Coast seems to have been most heavily seeded from Europe and Italy in particular, New York in particular. So the West Coast was seeded earlier from travel from China. And the other thing we know now is that parts of the East Coast were actually seeded from the West Coast. So there was sequence work done on the strains in Connecticut, where I live. 7 cases, they sequenced the strains to look at the genetic profile of the virus, and they were strains related to outbreaks in Seattle. So Washington State effectively seeded parts of the country, including Connecticut.
Lastly tonight, before I let you run, can you just assess where we are nationally? We've gotten some better news out of New York. We've spent some time talking about what's happening in Georgia. But nationally, where are we right now, in your mind, in our fight against this pandemic?
Well, look, things are showing improvement. We're seeing a decline in hospitalizations. We're seeing a decline in new cases. But we need to remember that it's an improvement off of a very difficult circumstance. When you actually look at the total number of new cases and you look at the total number of hospitalizations, they're still quite high. They're still very high. They're higher than they were when we first implemented these measures, these social distancing measures. And so we're not out of the woods yet. We have a long way to go. It's going to be probably 3 weeks before we see sort of sustained declines and levels come down to numbers that look like it's under control or look like we're getting it under control. So we're still, got a ways to go. Now, it's moving in the right direction. And as long as we continue to do the right things, that trajectory should continue.